There is a moment that repeats itself quietly in the lives of millions of people every single day. A person stands for prayer. Perhaps it is early morning before the sun rises, when the world is still half asleep. The room is quiet. The air carries that familiar stillness that comes before the day begins. Or maybe it is the last prayer of the night, when the house has grown silent and the mind finally slows down. The hands rise. Allahu Akbar. And then the same verses appear again, the words that every Muslim learns before almost anything else. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Surah Fatiha. It is the chapter we repeat more than any other words in our lives. A person may recite it thousands of times each year. By the time someone reaches adulthood, these 7 verses may have passed their lips tens of thousands of times. Children memorize it before they understand its meaning. Adults recite it so often that the tongue hardly needs to think. The words come automatically, but something subtle often happens in that moment. The tongue continues, while the mind quietly wanders somewhere else. A thought about work slips in. A memory from earlier in the day appears. A worry about tomorrow slowly drifts across the mind. And before the person realizes it, the recitation is finished. The prayer continues. Yet inside, nothing feels very different from before the prayer began. This experience is more common than most people admit, not because faith is weak, but because repetition has a strange effect on the human mind. When something becomes familiar, the heart sometimes stops noticing it. Imagine hearing a waterfall every day outside your home. At first the sound would feel powerful and alive, but after a while, you might stop hearing it entirely, even though the water never stopped flowing. Surah Fatiha can become like that, the most powerful chapter of the Quran, spoken so often that its depth becomes hidden behind its familiarity. Yet the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, described this chapter in extraordinary terms. He called it the greatest chapter in the Quran. It is known as al-Kitab, the mother of the book. Without it, the prayer itself is not considered complete. Which raises a quiet but important question. How can something so central to prayer feel so routine in daily life? Centuries ago, the great Sufi scholar Ibn Arabi spent years reflecting on that exact question. For him, Surah Fatiha was never just an opening chapter. He believed these 7 verses contained something far deeper, a kind of map of the relationship between the human soul and the divine reality. He once wrote that if a person truly understood even one verse of this surah as it was meant to be understood, their entire perception of existence could change. Not because the words themselves change, but because the person hearing them changes. Ibn Arabi approached Surah Fatiha the way a traveler studies a map before a long journey. Every line, every word, every phrase seemed to contain layers that pointed toward something larger. And slowly, he began to see a pattern hidden within the verses. A structure, almost like the rhythm of a conversation. Most people assume Surah Fatiha is simply praise followed by a prayer for guidance. But Ibn Arabi noticed something that many readers overlook. The surah moves in 2 directions at once. The first part speaks about God, acknowledging His reality, His mercy, His authority. Then something shifts. Suddenly, the speaker is no longer describing God. Now the servant is speaking directly to Him. A dialogue begins. And once you notice that shift, the entire chapter feels different. You are no longer reciting words into the air. You are standing in the middle of a conversation that has been unfolding for centuries. This is why Surah Fatiha never appears only once in prayer. It is repeated again and again in every unit of Salah, as if the believer is constantly being invited back into that conversation. But like many conversations in life, its meaning can be missed if we rush through it. Think of the difference between greeting someone politely and truly listening to what they are saying. The words may be the same, but the awareness is completely different. For Ibn Arabi, Surah Fatiha was meant to awaken that awareness. Each verse gradually reorients the human heart. It reminds the soul where it stands, who it depends on, and what it truly needs. And when someone begins to see these verses that way, the prayer itself starts to feel less like a ritual and more like an encounter with reality. But that encounter begins even before the first verse of the surah. Because before Surah Fatiha truly begins, there is a phrase that quietly opens the door to everything that follows. 4 simple words that most people say quickly, almost without thinking. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. For many people, it feels like a respectful introduction. But Ibn Arabi believed that those 4 words already contain the key to understanding the entire surah. And once you begin to see what he saw in that opening phrase, you realize that the prayer has already begun to transform long before the first verse is even spoken. Before the first verse of Surah Fatiha is even spoken, something subtle has already happened. The believer has already said a phrase so familiar that it often passes unnoticed. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Most people treat these words as a simple opening, something polite, a way of beginning an action respectfully, like knocking before entering a room. But Ibn Arabi saw something far more profound. To him, these 4 words were not just the beginning of the surah. They were the key that unlocks everything that follows. He began with a detail that most people never think about. In Arabic, the phrase begins with the letter ba. Bismillah. That small letter means with or by means of. It is not a noun. It is not a subject. It is a preposition, a word that connects one thing to another. At first glance, this may seem like a small grammatical detail. But Ibn Arabi believed it reveals something fundamental about existence itself. When the phrase begins with by means of, it quietly declares that nothing truly begins on its own. Every action, every movement, every breath begins through something beyond us. Think about the simplest act of life, breathing. We often feel as though we are the ones breathing, but pause for a moment and notice something strange. You can decide to hold your breath for a few seconds, but eventually your body will take over. The lungs move again. Air returns whether you command it or not. Life itself is flowing through you in ways that you do not control. Ibn Arabi believed Bismillah is the acknowledgement of this reality. It is the recognition that nothing in our lives truly begins from our own independent power. Not our actions, not our thoughts, not even the words we are about to speak in prayer. Everything begins by means of God. In that sense, the phrase is not merely a polite opening. It is a quiet act of humility. Before you speak, you admit that even the ability to speak has been given. Before you act, you recognize that the strength to act is not entirely yours. It is as if the believer is saying, I do not begin this moment alone. But Ibn Arabi noticed something else hidden within the phrase. The verse says in the name of. It does not specify a particular name first. It simply points to the idea of the name itself. In the language of the Quran, the names of God are not just titles. They represent the ways divine qualities appear in the world. When someone shows kindness, the name Ar-Rahman is being reflected. When wisdom guides a decision, the name Al-Hakim is quietly present. When provision arrives unexpectedly, the name Ar-Razak has manifested. In this way, Ibn Arabi explained that every action in the world unfolds under one of the divine names. When a mother comforts her child, mercy is flowing. When justice restores balance, truth is being revealed. The universe itself becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting these attributes in countless forms. So when a believer says Bismillah, they are doing more than beginning an action. They are acknowledging that the action itself exists under the presence of a divine name. Then comes the word that gathers all of those names together. Allah. Ibn Arabi described this name as the center around which all the other names revolve. While each divine name describes a particular quality, mercy, wisdom, power, justice, the name Allah points to the reality that contains all of them. It is the name of the essence beyond description, the source behind every attribute. Like sunlight that appears in many colors when it passes through glass, the divine names reveal different aspects of the same reality, but the light itself remains one. And then Surah Fatiha introduces the two names that define the relationship between the Creator and creation. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Ibn Arabi spent long passages reflecting on why these two names appear at the very beginning. Why not power? Why not majesty? Why not authority? Why mercy? To understand this, he pointed to something everyone experiences every day. Look at the sun. It rises over cities and villages alike. It warms the homes of the grateful and the ungrateful. It shines on the farmer and the thief without asking who deserves its light. This is what the scholars describe as Rahman, mercy that embraces everything. Existence itself is an expression of that mercy. No one asked to be born. No one earned the right to breathe. Life arrived as a gift before we even understood what life was. But the second name introduces another dimension. Rahim, mercy that is received according to openness. Imagine two people standing in the rain. The rain falls on both of them equally. But one person lifts their hands and drinks. The other keeps their hands closed. The rain did not change. The difference was in how it was received. In the same way, Ibn Arabi suggested that the world is already overflowing with mercy. But the amount we experience often depends on how open our hearts are to recognizing it. When a person becomes grateful, mercy feels closer. When a person becomes patient, mercy begins to reveal hidden wisdom. When someone becomes aware of the divine presence in their life, even ordinary moments begin to feel meaningful. And all of this meaning was already hidden within the opening phrase of Surah Fatiha. 4 words spoken in seconds. Yet within them lies an entire vision of existence. A beginning that reminds the soul where it truly stands. Before the prayer continues, the believer has already admitted something essential. That life itself is not happening independently. It is unfolding through divine mercy at every moment. And once that realization settles into the heart, the next verse of Surah Fatiha begins to sound very different. Because now the soul knows who it is speaking about when it says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. All praise belongs to God, the Lord of all worlds. Once the opening phrase has oriented the heart, Surah Fatiha moves into its first verse. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. All praise belongs to God, the Lord of all worlds. These words are among the most familiar phrases in the Muslim world. They appear in prayers, in conversations, in moments of relief and gratitude. A person might say them after receiving good news or after escaping difficulty. But Ibn Arabi believed that most people misunderstand what this phrase truly means. Many assume Alhamdulillah simply means thank God, a way of expressing gratitude for blessings. Yet praise and gratitude are not the same thing. Gratitude usually arises when someone has done something for us. If a friend helps you in a difficult moment, you thank them. If someone gives you a gift, you feel grateful. But praise works differently. You praise something because of what it is, not necessarily because of what it has done for you personally. Think of the moment you stand at the edge of the ocean. The waves roll endlessly toward the shore, the horizon stretches beyond sight, and the vastness of the sea leaves you quiet for a moment. You might say, Subhan Allah. You are not thanking the ocean. You are recognizing its beauty. Praise is the acknowledgement of excellence and perfection, whether it directly benefits you or not. And this is what Surah Fatiha begins with. Not a request, not a complaint, not even gratitude for blessings. The very first response to God is praise. Ibn Arabi reflected deeply on this order. He believed it reveals something essential about the human relationship with the divine. Before the soul asks for anything, it must first recognize reality. It must recognize who God is. The verse does not say, I praise God. It says something far broader. All praise belongs to God. This small difference carries enormous meaning. Every expression of praise that has ever existed ultimately points back to Him. When someone admires the beauty of a sunset, when a person feels awe while looking at the stars, when the heart is moved by kindness, courage, or wisdom, these moments of recognition are reflections of something deeper. They are glimpses of the perfection that belongs fully and completely to God. Even the ability to praise is not entirely ours. The awareness that recognizes beauty, the tongue that speaks words of admiration, the mind that understands excellence, all of these are gifts, which means when a person says Alhamdulillah, they are not offering something to God that He lacks. They are acknowledging a truth that already exists. Ibn Arabi described this as the moment when the human soul aligns itself with reality. Instead of beginning prayer with personal concerns, the believer first turns their attention outward, toward the nature of existence itself. And that existence is sustained by a presence described in the next part of the verse. Rabbul Alamin, the Lord of all worlds. The word Rab carries meanings that go far beyond the English word Lord. It does not only describe authority, it describes care, development, nurturing. A Rab is someone who guides something from its earliest stage toward its full completion. A teacher guiding a student through years of learning. A gardener tending a plant as it slowly grows from seed to fruit. A parent raising a child through every stage of life. In each of these examples, the one guiding the process provides exactly what is needed at each moment. Sometimes nourishment, sometimes correction, sometimes patience, sometimes protection. This is what the word Rab implies. According to Ibn Arabi, Surah Fatiha reminds us that God's relationship with creation is not distant or passive. It is active, continuous. The world is not a machine left running on its own. Every moment of existence is sustained by divine nurturing. The cells in your body quietly renewing themselves. The thoughts forming in your mind. The breath moving through your lungs. All of it unfolds within a reality that is constantly being sustained. And then the verse expands this idea even further. Rabbul Alamin, Lord of all worlds. The Quran does not speak of only one world. The physical world we see is only one layer of existence. There are worlds of spirit, worlds of unseen beings, worlds of meaning and imagination. Even within human life, there are many worlds. The inner world of thoughts, the emotional world of the heart, the social world of human relationships. Each of these layers is part of the vast creation sustained by God. Ibn Arabi believed that when a believer says this verse with awareness, they begin to see their life differently. Instead of feeling alone in a random universe, they recognize themselves as part of a living reality held together by divine care. Nothing in existence is outside that care. And just when the mind begins to grasp that idea, the next verse returns to the same two names that opened the surah. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the most merciful, the most compassionate. At first it might seem like repetition, but Ibn Arabi explained that the repetition changes the way we hear those names. In the opening phrase, mercy described how we begin. Now mercy describes how God sustains the entire universe. The Lord of all worlds governs existence through mercy. The nurturing of life is not driven by harshness or indifference. It unfolds through compassion. Even when life becomes difficult, even when the path includes hardship, the deeper structure of existence remains rooted in mercy. But Surah Fatiha does not allow the soul to become careless within that mercy, because the next verse introduces a truth that balances everything we have heard so far. A truth that shifts the tone of the prayer in an important way. For after mercy and praise comes a reminder that every moment of life is also moving toward accountability. And that reminder appears in the next verse. After Surah Fatiha opens with praise and mercy, something subtle begins to shift. The verses so far have gently oriented the heart. They have reminded the believer that existence itself is sustained by divine care, that mercy surrounds creation, and that every breath unfolds under the nurturing of the one who governs all worlds. But then the next verse appears. Maliki Yawmiddin, Master of the Day of Judgment. At first glance, this verse seems very different from the ones before it. The previous verses spoke of mercy, compassion, and nurturing. This verse speaks about judgment, about accountability. It changes the atmosphere of the prayer. Ibn Arabi noticed that Surah Fatiha deliberately places this verse after the repeated mention of mercy. The believer first hears about compassion, generosity, and divine care. Only then comes the reminder that every life is also moving toward a moment of truth. Without that balance, the soul can easily drift toward two extremes. If a person only hears about mercy, they may become careless. They may assume that their choices do not truly matter. But if a person only hears about judgment, they may fall into despair, imagining that every mistake has already sealed their fate. Surah Fatiha holds both realities together. Mercy surrounds existence, but accountability gives life direction. Ibn Arabi also noticed something deeper within the verse itself. Most people understand the Day of Judgment as a future event, a moment at the end of time when all human beings will stand before God and the truth of their lives will be revealed. This understanding is correct. The Quran repeatedly describes that day as the moment when hidden realities become visible and every soul sees the result of what it has done. But Ibn Arabi suggested that the verse also points to something happening much closer than we usually think. The word yawm means day, but it can also mean a period of unfolding reality. In that sense, judgment is not only waiting in the distant future. Small forms of judgment are already unfolding every day. Consider the way actions shape a person over time. Someone who practices honesty repeatedly becomes trustworthy. Someone who constantly chooses selfishness slowly builds a life of isolation. Someone who nurtures patience grows into a calmer and stronger person. These transformations do not suddenly appear on the final day. They are already developing quietly in the present. Like seeds planted in the soil, the consequences of actions grow slowly before they ever become visible. In this way, every day carries a small reflection of the final judgment. Our intentions are recorded. Our actions shape our character. And the path we walk gradually becomes the person we are becoming. But Ibn Arabi paid special attention to another word in the verse. Din, often translated as judgment or religion. Yet the root meaning of the word carries another image, the idea of a debt being returned. Something borrowed eventually comes back to its owner. This changes the way the verse feels. Human life, according to this understanding, is something entrusted to us for a time. Our abilities, our opportunities, our moments, all of them are like loans given to us temporarily. The day of judgment is the moment when every trust is returned. The breath we used will be accounted for. The time we spent will be revealed. The intentions we carried will become clear. But here is where the balance of Surah Fatiha becomes so powerful. This reminder does not appear in isolation. It appears between verses filled with mercy. The same God who nurtures creation with compassion is also the one who calls creation to account. Justice and mercy are not opposing forces. They are part of the same divine wisdom. Think of a loving teacher guiding a student. The teacher encourages, supports, and explains patiently, but eventually the student must take an exam. Not because the teacher is cruel, but because growth requires accountability. Without accountability, learning would never become real. In the same way, Surah Fatiha reminds the believer that life is meaningful precisely because it is being witnessed. Every moment matters. Every choice leaves a trace. And this awareness transforms the tone of the prayer. The believer is no longer simply praising God from a distance. They are now standing before the one who knows their life completely. Yet the prayer does not end with judgment. Something extraordinary happens in the next verse. For the first time in the surah, the language shifts. Until now, the verses have spoken about God. He is the Lord of all worlds. He is the most merciful. He is the master of the day of judgment. But suddenly, the tone becomes personal. The servant stops describing God and begins speaking directly to him. And in that moment, the entire prayer reaches its center. Up until this point in Surah Fatiha, the believer has been speaking about God. The verses describe His mercy. They acknowledge His lordship. They recognize His authority over the day of judgment. But then something remarkable happens in the next verse. The direction of the prayer changes. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. For the first time in the surah, the language shifts from description to direct address. No longer he. Now it is you. Ibn Arabi believed this shift is not accidental. It marks the moment when the prayer becomes fully alive. Imagine speaking about someone while they are not present in the room. You might describe their character, their kindness, their actions. But the moment that person walks in and stands before you, something changes. Your words change. Your awareness changes. You are no longer speaking about them. You are speaking to them. This is the moment Surah Fatiha reaches. The believer has oriented the heart with praise and reflection. They have acknowledged mercy and accountability. Now they stand face to face with the one they have been describing. And the first thing they declare is simple, yet immense in meaning. You alone we worship. Ibn Arabi reflected deeply on the meaning of worship. In everyday understanding, worship often refers to rituals, prayer, fasting, remembrance, acts of devotion. But he argued that worship goes much deeper than these visible actions. The root of the Arabic word, ibadah, is connected to the idea of servanthood, the recognition that something belongs entirely to its master. In this sense, worship is not only what happens during prayer. It is the recognition that our entire existence belongs to God. The breath that fills our lungs, the heartbeat moving quietly in the chest, the thoughts passing through the mind. None of these were created by us. They were entrusted to us. When a believer says, "You alone we worship," they are acknowledging this deeper truth. They are recognizing that their life is not self-owned. It is borrowed. Yet the verse does not stop there. Immediately after this declaration comes another sentence. "And you alone we ask for help." At first glance, the two phrases seem straightforward. But Ibn Arabi saw within them one of the most important paradoxes of the spiritual path. Think about what the believer is saying. They declare that their purpose is to worship God alone. But in the very next breath, they admit that they cannot even fulfill that purpose without His help. In other words, the servant wants to worship God, but the ability to worship God must also come from God. Ibn Arabi believed this realization dissolves one of the greatest illusions of the ego, the illusion that spiritual effort belongs entirely to us. A person might pray regularly, fast often, or spend time learning sacred knowledge. Over time, they may begin to feel proud of these efforts. But this verse gently removes that pride. Because if God withdrew His support for even a moment, the ability to worship would disappear. The strength to stand in prayer would fade. The clarity to remember God would vanish. Even the desire to seek goodness would weaken. This is why the verse pairs worship with seeking help. The servant is not only declaring devotion. They are confessing dependence. A simple image can help illustrate this idea. Imagine a mirror placed in sunlight. The mirror reflects the light beautifully, but the mirror cannot produce the light itself. If the sun disappears, the reflection disappears as well. In the same way, human devotion reflects something greater than itself. Our acts of worship shine only because divine guidance and strength are reaching us. And once a person understands this, something subtle happens inside the heart. Spiritual pride begins to dissolve. It becomes impossible to look down on someone who struggles in their faith. Because the believer realizes that the difference between people is not simply effort. It is also divine enabling. One person prays easily. Another struggles to focus. One person feels close to God. Another feels distant. But this verse reminds the believer that no one stands before God through their own power alone. Everyone stands through a combination of effort and mercy. Ibn Arabi also drew attention to a small detail in the verse that many people overlook. The verse does not say, "I worship." It says, "We worship." Even though the believer may be praying alone in a quiet room, the words place them within a community. Human beings approach God together. The prayer speaks on behalf of humanity. It recognizes that no person stands before God as an isolated individual claiming personal achievement. Instead, every believer is part of a larger human family, a community of souls seeking guidance together. And that request for guidance appears in the very next verse. Because once the servant acknowledges their dependence, a question naturally arises. If we cannot walk the path alone, then what is the most important thing we should ask for? Surah Fatiha answers that question in the simplest way possible. The soul asks not for wealth, not for comfort, not for power. It asks for something far more fundamental. It asks to be shown the way. After acknowledging complete dependence on God, the prayer arrives at its first request. IHDINA, letter 1E63, letter 1E63 IRA Macron, letter 1E6DL Mustaqim. Guide us to the straight path. At first, the request seems almost simple. Out of all the things a human being might ask for health, success, safety, wealth, peace, the prayer asks for only one thing: guidance. Ibn Arabi believed this choice reveals something profound about the nature of human life. Because guidance quietly determines the outcome of everything else. Think about two travelers beginning a journey. One traveler starts on the correct road. The path may be long, even difficult. There may be storms, delays, and obstacles along the way. But because the direction is correct, every step eventually brings the traveler closer to their destination. The second traveler may walk comfortably, with smooth roads and beautiful scenery. Yet if the direction is wrong, every step carries them further away from where they need to be. In the same way, life's experiences do not always tell us whether we are moving in the right direction. A person may experience comfort, yet slowly drift away from truth. Another may face hardship, yet quietly grow closer to wisdom. The difference is not always the circumstances. The difference is guidance. This is why Surah Fatiha teaches the believer to ask for guidance before asking for anything else. Because once the path is clear, everything else in life begins to take its proper place. Ibn Arabi also reflected on the phrase itself. Letter 1E63, I.R.A. Macron, letter 1E6D al-Mustaqim. The straight path. Many people imagine the straight path as a life without difficulty, a smooth road free from hardship. But the word mustaqim does not necessarily mean easy. It means direct, a straight line between 2 points, the shortest path toward the destination. Sometimes that path passes through challenges. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it demands letting go of habits or desires that once felt comfortable. Yet even when the path becomes difficult, it remains straight because it leads toward truth. Think of a mountain trail. The climb may be steep, the air may grow thin, the traveler may need to pause for breath again and again. But each step upward still leads toward the summit. In the same way, guidance does not guarantee a life free from struggle. What it guarantees is direction. It ensures that the struggles themselves carry meaning. Without guidance, even success can become dangerous. A person might achieve wealth and become arrogant. Another might gain influence and begin to misuse power. But when guidance is present, blessings become tools for growth instead of distractions. Ibn Arabi also noticed something subtle in the wording of the verse. The prayer does not say, "Guide me." It says, "Guide us." Once again, the believer speaks as part of humanity. Every person standing in prayer asks not only for their own guidance, but for the guidance of others as well. This transforms the prayer into something larger than individual salvation. It becomes a shared request for the well-being of the entire human community. And there is another detail hidden within the grammar of the verse. The word aitina, guide us, is expressed in a form that implies continuous guidance. Not guidance once, not guidance long ago, but guidance that must be renewed again and again. This is why Surah Fatiha is recited in every unit of prayer, at least 17 times a day, because the path of life is constantly changing. New situations appear, new choices arise, new temptations quietly enter the heart. The guidance that was clear yesterday may not be enough for the decisions of today. In this way, the prayer becomes a daily realignment. Each time the believer recites these words, they are quietly admitting something important. I cannot navigate life alone. I need guidance again. And perhaps that admission is itself a form of guidance. Because the moment a person believes they no longer need direction, they are already drifting away from it. But Surah Fatiha does not leave the meaning of the straight path undefined. The next verse explains the path more clearly. And interestingly, it does so not by describing the path directly, but by showing the two ways people lose it. After asking for guidance, Surah Fatiha continues with a final clarification. Letter 1E63, I.R.A. Macron, letter 1E6D, A.L. Ladhina Anamtu Alayhim. The path of those you have blessed. Suddenly, the prayer becomes very concrete. Instead of describing the straight path in abstract terms, the verse points toward people. The path is not just a set of ideas or principles. It is a way of living that has already been walked by others. Throughout history, there have been men and women whose lives embodied clarity, humility, and faith. The Quran mentions them in different places: the prophets, the truthful, the righteous, and those who devoted their lives to justice and sincerity. When a believer asks for the straight path, they are asking to walk in the same direction those people walked. Not necessarily to live the same circumstances, but to carry the same orientation of the heart, to see the world through the same awareness of God. But then the verse continues with an unexpected turn. Gairul Magjubai, Alayhim wa l a letter 10d letter 10da macron lli macron n. Not the path of those who earned anger, nor the path of those who went astray. Ibn Arabi reflected deeply on why the verse ends this way. Instead of simply describing the straight path in positive terms, the Quran shows the two directions that lead away from it. Two different ways the human soul can lose its balance. The first group is described as those who earned anger. Classical scholars often explain that this refers to people who recognized truth but chose not to follow it. They had knowledge, they understood guidance, yet their actions moved in a different direction. Ibn Arabi believed this represents one of the most subtle dangers on the spiritual path: the danger of knowledge without transformation. A person may study religion for years. They may memorize verses, learn teachings, and become skilled in explaining ideas. But if that knowledge never enters the heart, if it never reshapes the way they live, then it remains incomplete. Imagine someone who studies medicine for decades but never treats a patient. Or someone who reads books about compassion yet never practices kindness. Knowledge alone does not change a person. It must become action. Otherwise, the heart slowly becomes heavy with truth it never lived. But the verse also warns about another imbalance: those who went astray. These are people who act with sincerity and emotion, but without clear guidance. Their intentions may be good. Their enthusiasm may be strong. Yet without knowledge to guide them, their actions may lead them away from the very truth they seek. Ibn Arabi described this as passion without wisdom. It is like someone walking confidently through a forest at night without a map. Their energy is strong, but their direction is uncertain. In the end, both extremes lead away from the straight path. On one side stands knowledge without action. On the other side stands action without knowledge. The straight path exists between these two. It is the meeting point where understanding and sincerity work together, where the mind recognizes truth and the heart chooses to live by it. And perhaps this is why Surah Fatiha ends with this reminder. Every day, every person quietly moves along one of these directions. Sometimes we learn something meaningful but fail to act on it. Other times we rush into action without taking time to understand what is right. Guidance is the balance that keeps both parts of the soul aligned. When knowledge becomes humility and action becomes wisdom, the path begins to straighten beneath our feet. This is why Surah Fatiha remains at the center of every prayer. Not because it is short, but because it quietly reorients the believer again and again. It reminds the soul where it stands. It reminds the heart who it depends on. And it reminds the mind that guidance is not a destination reached once. It is a direction chosen every day. Each time these 7 verses are recited, the believer is invited to pause and realign, to remember mercy, to remember accountability, to confess dependence, to ask for guidance once more. And if those words are spoken with awareness, something subtle begins to change. The prayer is no longer just a routine recitation. It becomes a conversation, a moment where the human heart stands honestly before the one who knows it completely. And perhaps that is what Ibn Arabi spent so many years trying to show, that within these 7 verses lies a map of the entire spiritual journey. A journey that begins with praise, moves through humility, and ends with the quiet hope of being guided home. Tonight, when you stand for prayer, try something simple. Recite Surah Fatiha a little slower than usual. Pause after each verse. Let the words settle in your chest before moving to the next one. Notice what it feels like to say, "You alone we worship." Notice what it feels like to truly ask, "Guide us to the straight path." The verses themselves have never changed. They have been recited the same way for more than 14 centuries. But something can change in the way we hear them. Sometimes a verse we have repeated thousands of times suddenly opens in a new way. And in that moment, prayer stops feeling like routine and begins to feel like a conversation. Have you ever experienced a moment like that with Surah Fatiha or another verse of the Quran? Share your reflection in the comments below. Someone else may recognize their own journey in your story. And if this reflection helped you see these verses in a new way, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Voice of Sufism, and turn on the bell so you don't miss future reflections. Another journey into the hidden wisdom of everyday life is waiting for you in the next video on your screen.